The morning after the worst blizzard in a decade, 3 cabins in the valley were gone. Not damaged, not buried, gone. Roofs collapsed under the weight, walls split open by wind that had been clocking at 58 miles per hour since midnight. The settlers who survived did so by luck. A neighbor's floor, a borrowed blanket, a fire that almost went out. But on the north face of the ridge, something else happened. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the rock. Not from chimney, not from a roofline, from the ground itself, or rather, from a narrow slot in the granite face, barely wide enough for a man to turn sideways. And from that slot, a man stepped out, then a woman, then 2 children. Calm, warm, carrying a pot. They had not burned through the night, scrambling to feed the fire. They had slept. The neighbors who came to check on the bodies found, instead, breakfast. No one could explain it. The structure, if you could call it that, had no real walls visible from outside. No peaked roof. No corner posts sticking out of the snow. Whatever had been built into that crevice looked, from 50 yards away, like nothing at all. And that was exactly the point. What this man had pressed into the rock 2 autumns before was not a conventional shelter. It was something that broke almost every rule of frontier construction. Something that looked, to anyone watching, like a mistake. A waste of effort. A strange obsession with a hole in the cliff. They had questions. He had answers, but only after the storm. The secret was not in the fire he built. It was not in the blankets, the provisions, or the preparation. It was in the shape of something impossibly large forced into a space that should never have held it, and in what happened to heat, wind, and cold when stone was used not as a wall, but as an engine. This story is about what he understood that the others didn't, about the physics hiding inside a crack in the earth. About a method so counterintuitive that it looked like madness until the temperature dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind stopped arguing. If you've ever wondered whether the old ways of building were truly smarter or just older, stay with us. And before we go further, if this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Whether you're in a farmhouse in Montana, a cabin in northern Canada, or an apartment wondering what you'd do if the grid went down tonight. We want to know. You're part of this. Now, let's go back to that ridge. His name was Callum Adler. He had arrived in the territory in the early 1880s, not with a wagon train, not with a company of settlers, but alone on a mule named after a river he'd crossed twice and never wanted to cross again. He carried a hand axe, a surveyor's compass that may or may not have been accurate, and a habit of looking at the ground more than the horizon. The other settlers noticed that last part immediately. A man who builds by looking up is planning. A man who builds by looking down is either superstitious or strange. Callum Adler was, in the opinion of most people in the valley, both. He had come from a place where the winters were long enough to teach a man things that comfort could not. His family, oral accounts suggest, had built in stone for 3 generations in the highlands of Pennsylvania, where the ridgelines ran northeast and the wind always came from the wrong direction. He had watched his father study a hillside the way other men studied a contract, slowly, skeptically, looking for what it was hiding. When Callum first walked the north face of the ridge above the settlement, he didn't look at the trees for lumber. He didn't measure the flat ground for a foundation. He walked directly to a long, narrow fracture in the granite face, a natural crevice running roughly 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide at the mouth, and descending at a slight angle into the rock for nearly 14 feet before it opened into a broader pocket, roughly 11 feet across at its widest point. He stood inside it for a long time. The wind, which had been cutting steadily across the ridge at what one local account described as enough to make a man reconsider, dropped to almost nothing the moment he stepped past the first 2 feet of the opening. The temperature, even in early October, felt noticeably different. Not warm, but still. The cold was there, but it was not moving. To Callum, that was the difference between cold that kills and cold that merely exists. He spent the rest of that afternoon walking the perimeter of the crevice on the outside, pressing his palms against the granite face, measuring with his hand span. A method his father had called reading the stone's memory. The rock on the south-facing exterior was sun-warmed well into the evening. The rock on the interior walls of the crevice was consistent. Cool, yes, but not fluctuating with the wind. It was holding temperature the way a buried root cellar holds temperature, passively, steadily, without effort. That was the first thing Callum understood. The crevice was not a hole. It was a vessel. By November, he had staked his claim on that patch of ridge. The neighbors in the valley, 12 families spread across half a mile of creek bottom, heard about his decision and reacted with the practical concern of people who had seen bad winters. He's building in the rock. One account attributes to a man named Jessup, a carpenter from Ohio who had already framed 3 conventional log cabins that season. That's not building. That's hiding. Callum Adler didn't argue. He went back up the ridge and started measuring the mouth of the crevice with a piece of cord. What he was calculating, what no one watching him could yet understand, was not how to fit something into the crevice. He was calculating how to fit something that was deliberately, precisely too large for it. That calculation would take him 3 more weeks to complete. And when the neighbors saw what he was preparing to press into that crack in the earth, the mockery shifted from concern to open laughter. He let them laugh. The stone didn't care, and neither, it seemed, did he. The structure Callum Adler was building was not made of standard-cut lumber. It was a cylinder, a rounded, barrel-shaped frame of green-cut hardwood logs, each one roughly 6 inches in diameter, bent and lashed together in overlapping rings using a technique that local oral accounts describe as something he'd learned from a man who bent boat ribs. The rings were stacked and pinned with wooden dowels, creating a form that was, in cross-section, roughly circular, approximately 7 feet in interior diameter and just over 9 feet tall. The mouth of the crevice, at its widest point, measured 4 feet and 3 inches. When Jessup the carpenter walked up the ridge and saw what Callum was building beside the crevice entrance, he stopped walking and stared for a full minute before speaking. "That won't go in there," he said. Callum was fitting the last ring of the cylinder's upper section. He looked at the crevice, then at the cylinder, then back at Jessup with the expression of a man who had already calculated the answer to a question the other person hadn't finished asking. "No," he agreed. "Not yet." What Jessup, and most of the others who climbed the ridge to watch over the following days, failed to understand was that Callum was not trying to slide the cylinder into the crevice like a letter into an envelope. He was going to compress it. Green hardwood, freshly cut, carries a significant amount of moisture and flex. The logs Callum had selected, a mix of young white oak and ash, cut no more than 2 weeks prior, were still pliable enough to deform slightly under lateral pressure without splitting. His cylinder, measured at its widest cross-section, was approximately 7 feet and 2 inches in outer diameter. The natural pocket inside the crevice, at its broadest internal point roughly 8 feet back from the entrance, measured just over 6 feet and 10 inches wall to wall. He was pressing something 4 inches wider than the space into the space itself. The installation took 2 full days and the help of 4 men who had come up initially to tell him it was impossible and stayed because they couldn't stop watching. Using a system of rope leverage anchored to a cedar post driven horizontally across the crevice mouth, Callum's team applied steady inward pressure to the cylinder while he worked the frame into the opening at an angle, exploiting the slight taper of the crevice walls to guide the structure as it compressed. The logs groaned. The dowels held. The granite walls of the crevice, rough and uneven, caught the outer surface of the cylinder in dozens of contact points as it was pressed inward. Each contact point a grip, each grip a lock. When the cylinder finally seated, driven 14 inches deeper than the crevice entrance, its outer surface pressing hard against the rock on all sides, Callum drove a series of oak wedges between the frame and the granite at the top and base of the opening, sealing the compression permanently. He then stood back, ran his hand along the joint between wood and stone, and felt what he'd been expecting to feel. No gap, no draft, no movement. The structure wasn't attached to the rock in the conventional sense. There were no bolts, no mortar, no iron brackets. It was held in place entirely by the force of its own compressed diameter pushing outward against the stone, a principle as old as the Roman arch, applied sideways and underground. Jessup, standing behind him, said nothing for a long time. Then, "How long before it dries out and shrinks?" Callum picked up his axe. Long enough. He was right. Green hardwood in a sheltered granite pocket, away from direct wind and sun exposure, would take years, not months, to season down to its final dimensions. By the time the wood dried and the frame lost its outward pressure, Callum planned to have filled every joint with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and pine pitch. A secondary seal, belt and suspenders, as he would later put it. But that was a problem for the second winter. The first winter was already on its way. The interior work began the following week. Callum's wife, a woman named Edna who had said very little during the construction but had measured everything with her eyes, started on the floor while he worked on the roof insert and ventilation. Their 2 children carried stone. What they were building inside that compressed cylinder, set inside that crevice, inside that ridge, was something that no one standing outside in the valley could see, visualize, or easily dismiss. Until the storm came and made it undeniable. To understand why this worked, why a family could sleep through a minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard while their neighbors fought for survival, you have to set aside the image of a wall. Most frontier construction in the 1880s thought about warmth as a problem of blocking. Build a wall thick enough, stuff it with enough insulation, moss, sawdust, animal hair, and the cold stays out. The logic is sound as far as it goes. But it has a fundamental weakness. Any wall that can block cold can also lose heat. Every surface that separates inside from outside is also a surface through which thermal energy is constantly escaping. The thicker the wall, the slower the loss, but the loss never stops. Callum Adler's crevice did not work on that logic. The granite walls of a natural crevice had been accumulating and storing thermal energy for longer than any human structure in the territory had existed. Granite, depending on its mineral composition, has a volumetric heat capacity of approximately 50 BTUs per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. The rock mass surrounding Callum's shelter, conservatively estimated at several thousand cubic feet in direct thermal contact with the interior, was not a wall. It was a battery. During the warmer months, solar radiation had been absorbed by the exposed exterior face of the ridge and conducted slowly inward through the stone. By the time October arrived, the rock at a depth of 8 to 10 feet maintained a temperature of roughly 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the same principle that keeps a root cellar stable through winter without any active heating at all. This was the floor temperature the crevice started from. Not 10 degrees Fahrenheit, not 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 48 degrees passively before a single log was burned. A conventional cabin in the same valley, built on a flat foundation with 4 log walls and a shake roof, started its thermal battle from the outside air temperature, which in a hard Rocky Mountain winter could mean fighting for minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The gap between starting point and habitable temperature, roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit of difference, had to be covered entirely by fire. Callum's shelter started that same winter night from 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The gap to habitable temperature was less than 25 degrees Fahrenheit. He needed less than half the fire. But the granite battery did more than provide a warm starting temperature. As Callum's fire burned, a small, efficient firebox he had set into the back wall of the cylindrical interior, fed by a draft channel that ran upward through a natural fissure in the rock above. The heat it produced radiated outward in all directions. In a conventional cabin, heat radiating toward a log wall encounters the wall, warms it slightly, and then continues escaping outward into the cold air beyond. The wall absorbs some of that energy, but not much. Most is lost. In the crevice shelter, heat radiating outward from the firebox hit the granite walls within 18 to 24 inches of the source. That granite absorbed the heat, not as an obstacle, but as a storage medium. Stone does not transfer heat quickly. It absorbs it slowly and releases it slowly, creating a thermal lag that can extend hours beyond the last active fire. Oral accounts from the following spring suggest that Callum's fire, fed with between 3 and 4 logs per night during peak winter, kept the interior of the shelter at a sustained temperature of between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit through the coldest recorded nights of that winter. A comparable conventional log cabin of the same interior square footage, Testimony from neighboring settlers indicates required between 9 and 12 logs to achieve a similar result, and lost most of its accumulated heat within 90 minutes of the fire dying down. The cylinder itself played a critical third role that is easy to miss. By pressing outward against the granite with continuous force, it eliminated the air gap between the wooden frame and the stone wall. Air gaps are thermal breaks. They interrupt the conductive path between wood and rock and allow cold air infiltration. Callum's pressure-fit design had no air gap. The wood was in direct contact with the stone across hundreds of square inches of surface area, creating a conductive bond that allowed the wooden interior to share the rock's thermal mass rather than fighting against it. The result was a structure that behaved less like a cabin and more like a thermos, an interior shell held tightly within a massive thermal reservoir, insulated on 3 sides and partially on top by rock that changed temperature so slowly it functioned, on a human timescale, almost as a constant. This was not magic. It was not luck. It was the deliberate application of 3 physical principles: thermal mass, conductive coupling, and pressure sealing, by a man who may not have known those terms but had grown up watching stone remember heat long after the fire went cold. The blizzard that would test all of this was still 6 weeks away, and Callum Adler, by the end of October, was already calm. Most people, when they imagine a shelter pressed into a crack in a cliff, picture something cramped, something dark and low and desperate. A survival hole, not a home. A place you endure, not a place you inhabit. What Edna Adler built inside that cylinder was neither of those things. The interior of the compressed wooden frame measured 7 feet in diameter at floor level and just over 6.5 feet at its highest usable point, a ceiling that a tall man could stand beneath without ducking, provided he stayed near the center. The floor was not bare earth. Edna had insisted on that from the first week. She had Callum and the 2 children carry flat stones up from the creek bed below the ridge, flagstone-sized pieces of gray quartzite, each one between 2 and 4 inches thick, and she had laid them herself, dry-fitted without mortar, in a tight spiral pattern that covered every inch of the cylindrical floor. Those stones would prove to be one of the most important decisions made in the entire construction, not because they were decorative, because they were dense. Quartzite has a heat capacity close to that of granite, approximately 48 to 52 BTUs per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. A floor laid with 4 inches of quartzite across a 7-foot diameter circle contained, by rough estimate, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds of stone in direct contact with the living space. Every morning when Callum banked the fire, that floor had been absorbing radiant heat for 6 to 8 hours. Every night when the temperature outside dropped toward 0, the floor was still releasing the heat it had collected, slowly, evenly, at foot level, where it mattered most. The walls of the cylinder were lined on the interior with a double layer of split pine planks, each layer running in opposite directions, the first layer horizontal, the second vertical, with a packed fill of dried moss and wood shavings between them. This was not insulation in the modern sense. It was a buffer. It slowed the rate at which heat moved from the interior air toward the wooden frame and ultimately toward the stone. By slowing that movement, it extended the time during which the interior remained warm after the fire was reduced to coals. Against the rear wall of the cylinder, the deepest point of the crevice pocket, where the granite was thickest and most thermally stable, Callum had set the firebox. It was not a large structure. The firebox opening was 14 inches wide and 12 inches tall, deliberately small, because a small opening restricts the amount of cold air that can be drawn in to feed the combustion. A large, open hearth, the kind that dominated most frontier cabins of the era, draws prodigious amounts of cold air from floor level to sustain its fire, essentially vacuuming the warm air out of the room and replacing it continuously with cold. Callum's restricted firebox minimized that exchange. The fire burned smaller, hotter, and more efficiently, consuming less wood per hour while generating a higher proportion of radiant heat relative to convective heat loss. Above the firebox, Callum had constructed a smoke shelf of flat stone, a horizontal ledge set 6 inches above the firebox opening that interrupted the direct upward path of rising smoke and gases. This shelf created a small turbulent zone just inside the flue throat, forcing combustion gases to slow and mix before entering the draft channel. The practical effect was that more of the heat contained in those gases was transferred to the surrounding stonework before the gases escaped upward. Less heat left through the chimney. More stayed in the rock. The total thermal envelope of the finished shelter, rock walls, quartzite floor, double-planked wooden cylinder, and stone firebox, constituted what a modern engineer might call a high-mass, low-surface loss system. Every surface inside the shelter was either absorbing heat, storing it, or releasing it slowly back into the living space. There was almost nowhere for thermal energy to go quickly. Edna hung 2 wool blankets from a horizontal rod set across the cylinder's diameter, creating a divided sleeping space. She stored their provisions in a narrow alcove cut into the clay fill between the cylinder and the rock wall on the north side. She set a small pine table near the firebox. By the first week of November, the Crevice shelter was, by any practical measure, a home. Warmer in the mornings than most of the log cabins in the valley, quieter in the wind, and almost entirely invisible from 50 yards away. The children, local accounts suggest, stopped calling it the crack in the cliff by mid-November. They called it simply inside. There's a version of this story that ends in disaster. It is the version where Callum Adler, having solved the problems of heat retention, structural compression, and thermal mass, overlooked the one problem that has ended more underground shelter experiments than cold ever has. The problem that has no elegant fix, no clever geometry, no ancient trick from a father who studied hillsides. The problem of where the smoke goes. A fire needs 3 things to burn: fuel, heat, and oxygen. In an open-air structure, oxygen is never a limiting factor. The wind supplies more than enough, usually more than you want. But in a sealed, pressure-fit cylinder pressed deep into a granite crevice, oxygen behaves differently. It does not simply flow in. It must be drawn in by a pressure differential, a draft, and that draft depends entirely on the relationship between the temperature of the rising gases inside the flue and the temperature of the air outside at the point where those gases exit. If the exit point is too close to the fire, the temperature differential is small and the draft is weak. If the flue channel is too wide, cold air backflows down the channel and smothers the fire or floods the interior with smoke. If the exit point is downwind of the prevailing weather, storm pressure can reverse the draft entirely, pushing smoke back into the living space at exactly the moment when the fire is most needed. Callum had grown up watching his father manage these problems in stone structures built against Pennsylvania hillsides. He had seen what happened when the draft failed. A family spending a winter night with the door open in sub-freezing temperatures, choosing cold air over smoke inhalation. He had no intention of making that choice. His solution used the crevice itself as the primary component of the ventilation system. The natural fracture in the granite above the shelter's interior. The same fissure system that had helped carve the crevice over centuries of freeze-thaw cycles, ran upward through the rock face at a slight angle, emerging on the exterior surface of the ridge approximately 11 feet above the base of the crevice mouth and roughly 4 feet to the north. Callum spent 3 days probing this fissure with iron rods he had borrowed from the settlement's blacksmith, mapping its path through the rock and confirming that it was open, not blocked by clay or collapsed stone, for its full length. He then widened the lower section of the fissure, where it connected to the space above his firebox, using a hand chisel and mallet. He worked carefully, removing only enough material to allow the passage of smoke and hot gases, creating a flue channel approximately 8 inches wide and 5 inches deep that connected the smoke shelf above his firebox directly to the natural fissure above. The upper exit of the fissure, on the exterior face of the ridge, he capped with a flat stone set on 2 small granite blocks. A primitive but effective rain cap that allowed gases to exit horizontally from the sides while preventing rain, snow, and direct wind pressure from entering from above. The cap was set at a height that placed it well above the maximum expected snow accumulation for the ridge, ensuring that even after a heavy storm, the exit remained clear. The result was a draft channel that was, in effect, a heated stone pipe, 11 feet of granite surrounding the rising combustion gases, preheated by the fire below, creating a consistent temperature differential that produced a reliable upward draft even when exterior temperatures dropped to their lowest. The stone walls of the fissure did not cool the gases as they rose. They were warm enough from the fire's radiation to maintain the draft without interruption. For fresh air intake, Callum had incorporated a low-level vent into the base of the cylindrical frame on the side facing the crevice mouth, a channel approximately 4 inches wide and 3 inches tall, running through the base log ring and cover on the exterior with a fitted wooden plug that could be opened or closed from inside. By cracking this vent slightly, he could introduce a controlled trickle of fresh air at floor level, cold and dense, where it would travel along the floor toward the firebox rather than mixing immediately with the warm air at head height. This low intake and high exhaust created a gentle but persistent convective loop inside the shelter. Cold air entered at floor level, was heated by the firebox and the thermal mass of the quartzite floor, rose toward the ceiling, and exited upward through the flue channel. The living zone, between roughly 18 inches and 5 feet off the floor, stayed in a relatively stable band of warm, breathable air with low smoke concentration. Oral accounts from the following spring described the interior of the shelter during a cold night as clear as a still room, with a smell of pine and hot stone. No smoke accumulation, no eye irritation, no need to choose between warmth and breathable air. Callum had not invented the principle. It was the same convective logic that underpinned Roman hypocaust heating, the Korean ondal floor system, and the ventilation channels of ancient Anatolian cave dwellings, all arrived at independently by people who had spent enough time with fire in enclosed stone spaces to understand what air wanted to do when it was warm. He had simply read his particular crack in the earth carefully enough to let it do what it already knew how to do. The ventilation system was finished by the second week of November. The weather had already begun to change, and from the valley below, on cold mornings, a thin thread of smoke could occasionally be seen rising from what appeared to be bare rock on the face of the ridge, appearing from nowhere, rising cleanly, and disappearing into the sky without a chimney to explain it. Some of the settlers found it unsettling. Most found it merely puzzling. None of them yet understood what it meant. The storm arrived from the northwest on a Wednesday in late January. It had been building for 2 days, visible first as a low gray pressure on the horizon that the older settlers recognized and the newer ones underestimated. The temperature, which had been holding a tolerable 12 degrees Fahrenheit to 15 degrees Fahrenheit for most of the preceding week, dropped to -4 degrees Fahrenheit by noon on the day the storm front reached the valley. By sundown, it was -14 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, the thermometer at the settlement's trading post, a mercury instrument mounted on the exterior wall of the south-facing porch, noted in a ledger that still exists in a regional archive, read -31 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was the worst of the two problems. It came in sustained gusts that one account describes as a sound like a river running through the treetops, driving snow horizontally across the valley floor and packing it into the gaps of every log wall and window frame in the settlement. A wind at -31 degrees Fahrenheit does not feel like cold air. It feels like a physical force, a presence that enters a building not through the door, but through every imperfect joint, every small gap, every place where two pieces of wood meet and leave a space too thin to notice in October. The first cabin to show serious trouble was Jessup's, the carpenter from Ohio who had watched Callum build the cylinder and declared it impossible. His structure was well built by conventional standards: notched corner log walls, a fieldstone chimney, a shake roof with a good pitch. But it faced the prevailing wind on its long axis, and by 11 o'clock that night the wind infiltration had dropped his interior temperature to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, despite a fire he was feeding every 20 minutes. The chinking between his logs, a mixture of moss and clay applied the previous autumn, had partially dried and contracted over the winter, leaving hairline gaps that the storm found with mechanical precision. 2 other cabins in the valley had partial roof failures before dawn. The snow load on their shake roofs, combined with the sustained wind pressure on their gable ends, overstressed the ridge-pole connections, and caused sections of roofing to shift or collapse inward. The families in those structures spent the final hours of the storm huddled near their fires in conditions that, several accounts agree, were genuinely dangerous. On the ridge, the blizzard hit the north face of the granite with the same force it hit everything else. And then something happened that the physics had already predicted, even if no one watching from the valley could see it. The wind, striking the rock face, split around the crevice opening. The geometry of the crevice mouth, narrow, recessed, oriented at a slight angle to the prevailing wind direction, created a natural pressure shadow at the entrance. Rather than driving directly into the opening, the full force of the storm passed across the face of the ridge and left the crevice mouth in a zone of reduced pressure and dramatically reduced wind speed. Snow accumulated at the edges of the opening but did not pack into it. The entrance remained passable. Inside the cylinder, the storm was not present. Callum had banked the fire at 9 o'clock, added 4 split logs of dense white oak, closed the vent to its minimum setting, and adjusted the flue plug to reduce the draft to a slow, controlled draw. The quartzite floor had been absorbing heat for 12 hours. The granite walls were as warm as they were going to get. The thermal mass of the entire system, stone, rock, compacted earth, and the dense wood of the cylinder frame, represented somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds of heat-retaining material surrounding a space of roughly 380 cubic feet. At the moment Callum closed his eyes, the interior temperature was approximately 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of 92 degrees. He and Edna and their 2 children slept through the night. The fire burned down to deep coals by roughly 2 in the morning. No one woke to feed it. The thermal mass absorbed the deficit and continued releasing stored heat into the interior air at a rate slow enough that, by the time the last coals went dark around 4 o'clock in the morning, the interior temperature had dropped to approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit, still warmer than the inside of most of the valley's log cabins with their fires burning. At 6:30 in the morning, Callum woke to silence. Not the silence of a storm paused, the silence of a storm finished. He lay still for a moment, reading the air. The temperature against his face told him the fire was out. The absence of wind sound from above told him the worst of the blizzard had passed. The warmth of the stone beneath his bedroll told him the shelter had done what he had built it to do. He dressed, lit a small fire from the remaining coals and a handful of dry kindling, and put a pot of water on the iron hook above the firebox. Then he opened the entrance and stepped out into a world covered in 3 feet of new snow, with a sky the pale blue of extreme cold and a stillness so complete that the sound of his own breathing seemed loud. The valley below was quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that means people are still figuring out what happened to them. Callum Adler stood at the mouth of his crevice in the early morning light, breath rising in slow white clouds, and waited for the water to boil. Numbers have a way of ending arguments that words cannot. In the days following the blizzard, as the valley settlement dug itself out and took stock of the damage, the conversations that moved from cabin to cabin were full of impressions and feelings. The wind was terrible, the cold was the worst in years, the roof gave out faster than expected, the fire just couldn't keep up. These were true statements, but they were not precise ones. And in the absence of precision, people default to luck as an explanation. The cabin that survived did so because it was lucky. The family that stayed warm did so because of some vague combination of preparation and fortune. Callum Adler did not believe in luck as a structural principle. And so, over the 2 weeks following the storm, he did something that was unusual for a frontier settler in the 1880s and is almost certainly why this account has survived at all. He wrote things down. His notes, described in later regional historical records as a small leather-bound ledger, partially water-damaged, contain a series of observations recorded both before and after the blizzard that allow a reasonably precise reconstruction of the shelter's thermal performance. Not laboratory data, not controlled experiments, but the careful observations of a man who had been paying attention to the same variables for 2 full winters and knew what he was looking at. The exterior temperature on the night of the blizzard, as recorded at the trading post thermometer, reached a low of minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Callum's own temperature notation for the interior of the crevice shelter at the moment he woke, recorded by pressing his hand against a small mercury tube he had mounted to the interior wall of the cylinder, reads, in his ledger, as 54 in the morning, fire out 4 hours. That is 54 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature, fire extinguished approximately 4 hours prior, with an exterior temperature somewhere between minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential, the gap between inside and outside, was at that moment between 79 degrees Fahrenheit and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained passively, without active fire, through the thermal mass of rock, stone floor, and compressed wood alone. For comparison, oral accounts from 3 neighboring settlers record their interior temperatures on the same morning, with fires either still burning or recently fed, as ranging between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 42 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 of them described their water buckets as having a skin of ice on the surface despite fires burning through most of the night. Callum's fire consumption tells a parallel story. His ledger records wood usage for the blizzard night, as for oak splits at banking, nothing more. By his own estimation, those 4 splits, each roughly 18 inches long and 4 to 5 inches across, represented a total fuel load of between 28 and 35 pounds of dense hardwood. At the fire conditions he maintained, that fuel load would have sustained active combustion for approximately 3 to 4 hours before transitioning to a long, slow coal burn that gradually died out. The neighboring settlers who provided testimony the following spring reported wood consumption for that same night ranging from 9 to 14 splits per household, fuel loads of 65 to 110 pounds, with several families noting that they had burned through their overnight reserves and were feeding the fire with green or partially seasoned wood by the early morning hours. Green wood burns inefficiently and at lower temperatures, producing more smoke and less usable heat per pound, meaning that even their elevated fuel consumption was delivering diminishing returns precisely when the cold was at its worst. Callum's shelter had used, at rough estimate, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the wood that his neighbors burned that night, and it had produced better results. The reason for this ratio is not complicated once you understand the thermal starting point. A shelter whose walls, floor, and ceiling are composed primarily of materials with high heat capacity does not need its fire to heat the room. The room, in a meaningful sense, heats itself. The fire is needed only to replenish what the thermal mass is slowly losing to the exterior environment. In a well-designed high-mass system, that replenishment rate is low. In a low-mass system, a standard log cabin with thin walls and a large open hearth, the fire must do everything. Heat the air, heat the walls, compensate for draft infiltration, and fight the constant thermal drain of large surface areas in contact with cold exterior air. The difference, expressed in the simplest possible terms, is between heating a stone and heating a draft. One holds, one escapes. Callum's ledger contains one more notation that is worth dwelling on. Written 2 days after the blizzard, apparently in response to a conversation with Jessup, it reads, "He asked me how I kept it warm. I told him I didn't keep it warm. I kept it from getting cold. He said, that was the same thing. It is not. That distinction between active warming and passive thermal defense is the entire architecture of the crevice shelter in a single sentence. And it is a distinction that most modern construction, with its emphasis on mechanical heating systems over building envelope performance, has still not fully absorbed. By 9 o'clock on the morning after the blizzard, word had traveled through the valley, not through any organized effort. There are no telephones, no meeting bell, no system of communication faster than a man walking through 3 feet of new snow. But the valley was small, the families knew each other, and the damage from the storm was visible and immediate. People moved between cabins, checking on neighbors, assessing roofs, sharing what little information they had about what the night had been like inside each structure. The convergence on the ridge happened gradually, the way these things do. One person mentioning that Callum's place seemed fine, another deciding to walk up and see for themselves, a third following because the first 2 were already going. By mid-morning, A group of 7 or 8 settlers had gathered at the base of the ridge and made the climb up the snow-packed slope to the crevice. What they found, or rather, what they did not find, was the evidence of a struggle. There were no emergency repairs visible on the exterior. No sections of frame hastily rechinked with snow or bark. No scorch marks from a fire pushed too hard. No signs of the improvisation that marks a shelter that has been forced to exceed its design limits by a night that was worse than expected. The crevice mouth was clear of the heavy snow drifts that had formed against every vertical surface in the valley. The thin thread of smoke that several of them had noticed from below, rising from the upper exit of the granite fissure, just as it had every cold morning of the past 2 winters, was present again, calm and steady. Callum was outside when they arrived. He had been for some time. He had cleared a small area in front of the crevice entrance, stacked the previous night's ash in the stone pit he maintained outside for that purpose, and was splitting wood for the coming evening. A relaxed, routine task that communicated, without any words, that nothing unusual had occurred on his end of the ridge. Jessup was among the group. He stood at the edge of the cleared area for a moment, looking at the crevice entrance, then at the smoke rising from the rock above, then at Callum splitting wood with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had slept well. No one said anything for a beat that several accounts describe as notably long. Then one of the other settlers, a man named Orville Marsh, who ran cattle on the south end of the valley, said, quietly and without any particular theatrics, "You didn't lose a thing, did you?" It was not a question. Callum set another log on the block. "Stove's still warm," he said. "Edna's got coffee on if anybody wants it." The accounts of what followed are consistent in their details. The group of settlers filed, one by one, through the narrow entrance of the crevice and into the interior of the cylinder. They stood in silence for a moment, adjusting to the light and the warmth, looking at the quartzite floor and the stone firebox and the double-planked walls and the neatly divided sleeping space. Several of them placed their palms on the stone walls, the way Callum had done on his first day at the ridge, and felt what was there. Not just warm, held. A warmth that came from mass and memory rather than from the immediate presence of flame. Jessup, who was a practical man despite his earlier skepticism, asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking: "How much wood did you burn last night?" Callum told him. The silence that followed was, by all accounts, different from the one before the coffee. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic in their heads and arriving at a number that challenged something they had believed for years. Not a comfortable silence. Not admiring one, exactly. The silence of a working assumption being quietly revised. Jessup nodded slowly. He looked at the firebox at the low opening at the smoke shelf above it. He looked at the ceiling of rock above the cylinder. He looked at the floor. "The floor," he said. Not a question this time either. "The floor," Callum confirmed. What passed between those 2 words was an entire education in thermal mass, condensed into a single exchange between a skeptic and a builder, in a warm room inside a rock, on the morning after a blizzard that had tested everything the valley had built and found most of it wanting. Nobody laughed on the way back down the ridge. The walk was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of quiet that comes when a man is mentally rebuilding something he thought he already understood. Jessup, who had framed 3 conventional log cabins that season, did not speak at all until he was nearly back to the valley floor. Then he stopped, turned, and looked back up at the crevice, at the thin line of smoke rising from the bare rock, clear and steady against the pale winter sky. "I built the wrong thing," he said. No one disagreed. Callum Adler did not invent the crevice shelter. He arrived at it through a combination of observation, inherited knowledge, and the particular kind of problem-solving that happens when a man with good instincts faces a specific landscape and refuses to import assumptions that don't fit it. But the core principles he applied, thermal mass, earth integration, pressure-fit structural sealing, convective ventilation, were not new. They were, in fact, among the oldest principles in human construction, and they had been discovered independently and in remarkably similar forms by cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. The most direct parallel in North America was the pit house, a form of semi-subterranean dwelling used by dozens of indigenous peoples across the continent's interior, from the plateau peoples of what is now British Columbia and Washington state to the ancestral Puebloan communities of the Southwest. Pit houses were not primitive shelters improvised from desperation. They were sophisticated, climatically adapted structures that represented generations of refinement. A typical plateau pit house consisted of a circular excavation 4 to 6 feet deep and between 15 and 30 feet in diameter, with a framework of poles supporting a roof of smaller timbers, brush, and packed earth. The entry was often through a hole in the center of the roof, down a notched log ladder. The thermal logic was identical to Callum's. The earth surrounding the below-grade walls maintained a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions, dramatically reducing the thermal differential the interior fire had to overcome. Oral traditions and early ethnographic record from several plateau communities describe winter temperatures inside occupied pit houses as consistently comfortable, warm enough for sleep without continuous fire feeding, even during periods of prolonged severe cold. The Aleut and Onangan peoples of the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands developed the Barabara, a structure that took earth integration even further. Built partly underground and covered with a thick layer of sod, the Barabara used the ground itself as its primary insulating and heat-retaining material. The sod covering, sometimes 2 to 3 feet thick, had a thermal resistance roughly equivalent to 12 to 18 inches of modern mineral wool insulation, achieved entirely with local materials that required no processing beyond cutting and stacking. Russian naval records from the 18th century, describing encounters with Onangan communities during periods of extreme winter weather, note with consistent surprise that the interiors of these structures remained habitable and comfortable under conditions that would have been life-threatening in a conventional European timber frame building. In Scandinavia, the concept of the Jordkaller, earth cellar, extended the same principles to food storage and secondary living spaces, with walls and roofs of packed earth and stone that maintained near-constant temperatures through even the most severe Nordic winters. In the highlands of Anatolia and the Cappadocia region of modern Turkey, entire communities carved their dwellings into volcanic tufa rock, not as a measure of last resort, but as a deliberate architectural choice made by people who understood, through centuries of practice, that rock is a better thermal regulator than any material a human hand can assemble from scratch. What connects all of these traditions, from the plateau pit house to the Aleutian Barabara to the Cappadocian rock dwelling, is not style, not cultural exchange, not shared influence. It is convergent engineering, different people, different materials, different climates, all arriving at the same fundamental insight through direct observation of how their environments behaved. The insight is this: the Earth is not your enemy in cold weather. It is the most patient, most massive, and most thermally stable structure available to you, and it is already built. Every culture that figured this out did so the same way, by spending enough time in enough winters to notice that the ground, a few feet down, does not fluctuate with the storm. It does not spike and crash with the temperature. It holds, steadily, reliably, without fire, without effort, without cost. And if you build your shelter in contact with that steadiness rather than rising above it, you borrow that stability for free. Callum Adler had borrowed it from a granite crevice in a mountain ridge. The Onangan had borrowed it from the Aleutian tundra. The ancestral Puebloans had borrowed it from the canyon rock of the Colorado Plateau. Each in their own language, in their own materials, with their own tools, they had all read the same lesson in the same earth. The blizzard does not find what is already part of the mountain. There's a question worth sitting with at the end of this story. Not the technical question. We have answered that. The thermal mass, the pressure seal, the convective draft, the quartzite floor, the restricted firebox. The physics are real, the principles are sound, and the performance data, such as it is, supports the conclusion. The crevice shelter worked because it was designed around what the Earth does naturally, not around what a building can be forced to do artificially. The question worth sitting with is a different one. Why did it take a blizzard to make the others see it? Jessup was a skilled carpenter. He knew timber framing, notching, chinking, roofing. He had built 3 cabins that season that were, by the standards of the time and place, competent structures. He was not ignorant. He was not careless. But he had arrived at the territory with a complete mental model of what a proper shelter looked like. 4 walls, a roof, a chimney, a foundation, and that model had no room in it for a man pressing a wooden cylinder into a crack in a cliff. The model was not wrong. It was simply limited. It had been developed in conditions different from the ones it was now being asked to meet, and it had never been forced to account for the thermal behavior of granite or the wind geometry of a natural crevice, because those things had not been relevant where the model was built. This is the same limitation that modern construction carries, scaled up considerably and dressed in better materials, but structurally identical. The average American home built after 1970 has exterior walls that are 3.5 to 5.5 inches thick, filled with fiberglass or mineral wool insulation between timber studs. Those walls have an effective thermal resistance, an R value, of between R13 and R21. A 3-foot thick granite wall, by comparison, has a thermal resistance of approximately R1.5 per foot, meaning the rock is a far worse insulator by any standard metric than modern stud wall construction. And yet, the granite crevice outperformed every log cabin in the valley. The reason is that thermal resistance, R value, measures only one thing: how slowly heat moves through a material. It does not measure how much heat a material can store. It does not measure how long that stored heat continues to warm a space after the active heat source has been removed. It does not measure the buffering effect of a massive thermal envelope on the peaks and valleys of exterior temperature. These are the properties of thermal mass, and they are almost entirely absent from the lightweight, low-mass construction that has dominated residential building for the past 70 years. A modern home with our 21 walls loses its interior warmth within 2 to 4 hours of the heating system shutting down in severe cold. A well-designed high-mass structure, stone, rammed earth, adobe, or compressed into a granite crevice in an 1880s Rocky Mountain ridge, can maintain habitable temperatures for 12 to 24 hours or more after the last fire dies, depending on the exterior temperature and the total mass involved. We have traded thermal persistence for thermal resistance. We have traded patience for performance ratings. And in most cases, as long as the heating system keeps running, we never notice the difference. Until the grid goes down. Until the fuel runs out. Until a blizzard clocks in at minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 miles per hour for 14 hours, and the question is no longer what your R value is, but how long your walls remember being warm. Callum Adler's walls remembered for 4 hours past the last coal. And those 4 hours were the margin between breakfast and catastrophe. He did not discover anything that the Earth had not already been doing for 10,000 years before he arrived at that ridge. He did not invent a principle. He did not engineer a system from scratch. He looked at a crack in a cliff, placed his hand against the stone, felt the temperature that the rock had been holding quietly through every previous winter without anyone asking it to, and understood, with the clarity of someone who had been taught to listen to material rather than impose on it, that the shelter was already there. He just needed to move his family inside it. The blizzard never found them because they had stopped being above the mountain and started being part of it. And part of the mountain, as it turns out, is a very safe place to spend a January night. Build accordingly. Educational and historical content only. This script does not substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.